Welcome back, everyone. It's like sometimes I feel like our brains have these two totally different operating systems. One's all about ego, and the other is that thing, emotional intelligence.
Oh, yeah.
Today, we are diving deep into this. I think it's a fascinating dynamic. And
Absolutely.
of course, we've got a whole stack of sources to help us unpack it all. We've got psychology articles, leadership analysis, even a pretty thought-provoking Reddit discussion.
I love it. The clash of the titans, ego versus emotional intelligence. It really is a battle that plays out in our minds and just impacts like every decision we make, big or small.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really what we want to dig into today. How do these forces shape the choices that we make in our own lives, right? Those moments where you feel like a tug of war between what you really want to do and, well, what you know might be the smarter move.
Yeah, definitely. I think before we get into those kind of pivotal moments, maybe it makes sense to define what we're actually talking about here. When we say ego often gets kind of a bad rap, but it's not like inherently good or evil. It's that part of us that craves, recognition, strives for achievement. And sometimes, yeah, it can kind of inflate into this sense of like entitlement or control.
It's like that voice in our heads. It's like, you deserve this. You are the best one in the room. It's interesting how our sources like ego or emotional intelligence, which drives your decisions,
Mm.
and ego-driven versus principle-driven leadership, they both really highlight this focus on like personal gain, almost like winning is the only way that you measure success.
Yeah, and that kind of laser focus on just winning, 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 it can be a problem, especially when it comes to like leadership. The articles that we have here, they paint a really vivid picture of what happens when ego really takes over. You see resistance to feedback. People aren't open to hearing what other people think. You see transactional relationships where people are just seen as like pawns in a game,
Yeah.
and then this tendency to make really rash decisions, maybe even crossing ethical lines.
Yeah, it makes you think if like unchecked ego can lead to such disastrous outcomes, especially, for those in positions of power, how do we even begin to cultivate its counterpoint, emotional intelligence? Like, is it simply the absence of ego or is it something more than that?
That is a great question. And that is where the definition of emotional intelligence gets like really tricky, right? Because
Right.
it's not just about suppressing your ego. It is this whole set of skills, self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, social skills. Like it is the ability to both understand your own emotions and then navigate them, but also to understand and respond to the emotions of other people.
So it's like emotional intelligence gives us this internal compass almost that lets us make these decisions with greater clarity and intention rather than just reacting to the whims of our ego. I think how to be emotionally intelligent in love relationships and the importance of emotional intelligence, these articles really like make a great argument for all the good things that come out of high EQ. You got stronger relationships, you're more resilient, maybe even better physical health.
I love that. Yeah, this internal compass. I think what I find so fascinating is that so many of our sources, especially the intelligence in emotional intelligence, how people make decisions, they suggest that our feelings actually play a much bigger role in our decision-making process than we think. Much more than we consciously realize. It's almost as if our emotions are making these lightning fast calculations in the background, and then our rational mind is just trying to catch up and make sense of them.
So are you saying that we're not as rational as we like to believe we are?
Well, maybe not entirely. I mean, it's not that logic and reasoning are like useless, but it's more that our emotions, they're often driven by those desires and fears from our ego, and they can really impact our choices. This article even says that like feelings are negotiable. Like we can learn to work with them rather than just letting them control us.
Oh, okay. See, this is where it gets interesting to me. If we acknowledge that our feelings are so important, like how do we even become more aware of them? Where do we start? And then like how does being aware of them help us make better decisions?
You know, I like to think of it this way. If the ego is the impulsive kid that just wants everything right now, emotional intelligence is like the wise elder offering a more holistic perspective. It's about pausing before reacting, recognizing how you're actually feeling in that moment, and then consciously choosing how to respond.
So it's like hitting the pause button,
Yeah.
like getting off of autopilot.
Exactly. And that pause, that little bit of space, that's where we can, take a moment to assess what's going on, think about what might happen because of our actions, and then ultimately make a choice that actually aligns with our values, even if our ego's screaming for something totally different.
I really love this idea that emotional intelligence is like mediating between that impulsive ego and, our more reasonable self. But, what really got me in emotional intelligence and ego was that there were these, like, case studies of leaders, Travis Kalanick, Adam Newman, Elon Musk. These are brilliant guys, right?
Oh, yeah.
But their egos, their unchecked egos, seem to cause some major issues.
Yeah, those case studies, they're cautionary tales for sure.
They really are.
Yeah. It's easy to look at those examples and think, well, I'm not a CEO, so this doesn't really apply to me. But honestly, ego can show up in all of us, no matter what we do or where we are in life.
That is so true. It's not just about the big public failures, but it's about the choices we make every day,
Mm.
right? Like, think about a time when you had an idea at work and you just pushed forward with it, even though you had these doubts in the back of your mind.
Mhm.
Or maybe a relationship, a personal relationship, where you let your pride get in the way of communicating openly and honestly.
Oh, yeah, we've all been there, right? Those times where we just let our ego take the wheel and, well, it doesn't always work out the way we wanted.
Exactly. And it begs the question, what could those individuals have done differently? What role does emotional intelligence play in navigating those situations where ego's influence is so strong?
One of the most striking examples of emotional intelligence, even under huge pressure, is the story of Bill Ford stepping down as Ford's CEO.
Oh, right, right.
It would have been so easy to just hold on to the legacy, the family name. But he recognized his limitations, and he found someone who was better suited for that role at that time. I think it's such a powerful example of humility, which is a big part of emotional intelligence.
It is. Recognizing our limits and being willing to step back for the good of everyone. It seems like emotional intelligence isn't just about understanding how we feel. It's about knowing ourselves, like deeply, our strengths and our weaknesses.
100%. And it's about making choices that align with that understanding, even when it's tough, even when it goes against what our ego wants.
Yeah, I'm curious about something. Where do you draw the line between being confident in a good way, a healthy way, and ego just getting in the way?
Yeah.
Because confidence is a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Especially, for leaders.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a tough one. I think that's where self-awareness is key. Confidence that comes from knowing what you're good at and being open to learning and growing. That's very different from ego-driven arrogance. That's usually masking, like insecurity and this fear of not being good enough.
So it's like confidence is inviting people to collaborate, and ego's demanding to be in control.
That's a great way to put it. Confidence is about humility, recognizing we can always learn and get better. Ego, on the other hand, it's about protecting this fragile sense of self-importance, even if it hurts other people.
So how do we get that healthy confidence without letting our ego run wild?
Well, that's what we are going to explore as we keep going through our sources here. And of course, we've got that Reddit discussion you mentioned, which I think has some really valuable insights from everyday people wrestling with this same question.
Oh, yeah. That thread, what does emotional intelligence actually mean?
Mm-hmm.
It got pretty heated.
Oh, yeah.
It will be really interesting to see how those different perspectives kind of line up with what we're uncovering here.
For sure. And as we move forward, I'd love for you, the listener, to be thinking about this. Where do you see ego showing up in your life? And how could having more emotional intelligence, how could that help you deal with those situations better?
That is a great question to think about. We're going to keep going with this in our next segment, so definitely stay tuned for that.
As we kind of navigate this whole ego and emotional intelligence thing, I think it's really important to look at how it plays out in leadership.
Oh, for sure. Especially after all those cautionary tales we talked about, leaders where their egos just seem to take over. But I'm curious about the flip side. What does it look like when a leader is really emotionally intelligent?
Well, if we go back to that article, ego-driven versus principle-driven leadership, there's a pretty clear difference. Emotionally intelligent leaders, they operate from this really deep sense of purpose, this genuine desire to serve others, and a huge respect for the people they lead.
It's almost like instead of using power, they're giving power to other people.
Exactly. And that empowerment, it shows up in so many ways. Emotionally intelligent leaders, they really want to create an environment where people can communicate openly, where feedback is seen as a good thing, a chance to grow, and where different perspectives are welcomed, not shut down.
So it's not about having all the answers yourself. It's about creating this culture where everyone's intelligence is valued.
Yeah, exactly. It's about realizing that true leadership is about building a space where everyone on the team feels seen and heard and like they matter, where their talents are nurtured and their contributions are celebrated.
And speaking of celebrating contributions, it seems like empathy is really important here. We've talked about how crucial it is in personal relationships, but how does empathy work in leadership?
It's absolutely essential. Empathy lets leaders connect with their team members on a much deeper level to understand their viewpoints, their struggles, their goals. It's about realizing that everyone brings their own unique experiences and emotions to the table.
It's like tuning into this human symphony within the team, recognizing each individual instrument, but also appreciating the harmony they create together.
I love that. That's a great way to put it. And through that empathetic understanding, leaders can create this culture of trust and loyalty where people feel supported, not just managed.
As we go deeper into this emotionally intelligent leadership thing, I keep coming back to self-awareness. It's like all these other qualities, the empathy, communication, purpose-driven decision-making, they all come from a leader's ability to understand themselves.
Oh, absolutely. Self-awareness is the foundation of emotional intelligence.
Mhm.
Leaders who have this quality, they really understand their strengths, their weaknesses, what triggers them, and how their emotions might be affecting their actions.
It's like having this internal mirror that not only shows you your reflection, but also all the emotions, the motivations, even the ego's little whispers underneath.
Exactly. And that self-awareness gives leaders the ability to make more conscious choices to respond instead of just reacting, especially in those high-pressure moments when ego tends to take over.
Because let's be real, even the most experienced leaders have moments of doubt, frustration, even anger.
Yeah.
It's how they handle those emotions that makes all the difference.
You're right. And that's where self-regulation comes in. Emotionally intelligent leaders, they've learned how to manage their emotions, how to create that space between the trigger and their reaction, whether it's taking a few deep breaths, looking at the situation from a different angle, or even just stepping away for a minute to calm down. They know how to prevent their emotions from hijacking their leadership.
Sounds like emotional intelligence is this ongoing journey, not a destination.
Sure.
It's about constantly working on these skills, getting better at self-awareness, and building our capacity for empathy.
Exactly. It's about being okay with the fact that we're all human, we're all messy, we're all works in progress, and it's about committing to this constant practice of emotional growth.
And I imagine that practice takes a lot of humility,
Yeah.
being willing to admit when we've messed up or let our ego get the best of us.
Oh, totally. Humility lets us acknowledge our limitations, ask for feedback, and learn from our mistakes. It's about realizing we don't have all the answers, and that real growth often comes from being vulnerable.
It's about letting go of that need to be right, to be perfect, to have it all figured out.
Yes. And letting go of that can be so freeing. It allows us to be more authentic, to connect with others on a deeper level, and to lead with more compassion and understanding.
As we're talking, I'm remembering that Reddit thread you mentioned. What does emotional intelligence actually mean? What did you find in those everyday perspectives? Did you see any common themes or maybe even some conflicting views?
Oh, it was such a mix of different ideas. Some people defined emotional intelligence as being able to recognize and control your own emotions, really emphasizing the self-awareness part.
Which makes sense, that internal compass we were talking about.
Exactly. Others focused more on how emotional intelligence shows up in how you interact with the world, like being
Mhm.
able to build strong relationships, communicate effectively, and navigate social situations with grace and empathy.
So it's about how we connect and work with others, the interpersonal skills that let us collaborate.
Right. And then there were some people who even questioned whether emotional intelligence is a real thing at all. They thought it was more of a pop psychology buzzword than something you could actually measure scientifically.
That's interesting. It seems like the definition of emotional intelligence is still kind of evolving.
Yeah. And maybe that's part of what makes it so fascinating. It's this complex idea that doesn't fit neatly into a box. But what really stood out to me from that Reddit thread were the personal stories people shared about how emotional intelligence or the lack of it had affected their lives.
Oh yeah, those real-life examples that make these ideas so much more concrete.
Exactly. There were stories about relationships that were healed through empathy conflicts that were resolved because people could communicate well, and even people changing careers because they finally understood their own emotional patterns.
It just shows how emotional intelligence, no matter how you define it, can really shape our lives in some pretty profound ways.
For sure. And it reminds us that this isn't just some abstract concept we're talking about. It has real-world consequences for how we live, how we love, how we work, how we lead.
As we wrap up this part, I keep thinking about a question for that article, the intelligence in emotional intelligence, how people make decisions. It suggests that maybe instead of seeing our emotions as enemies we need to conquer, we can actually use their power to help us reach our goals.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. What if instead of trying to suppress or ignore our emotions, we actually learn to listen to them, to understand what they're telling us, and use that wisdom to make better choices?
I love that. It's
Yeah.
like inviting our emotions to the decision-making table, not as troublemakers, but as valuable advisors who might have insights we wouldn't see otherwise.
Exactly. And that's what we'll explore more in our last segment. Stay tuned as we dig into some practical tips for developing emotional intelligence, for bridging that gap between what our ego wants and what our hearts truly need.
So, as we start this last part of our deep dive, I keep thinking about something that's come up a lot. It's this idea that emotional intelligence isn't just about knowing our emotions, it's about using that knowledge to handle all the decisions we make every day.
It really is. It's like every time we have to make a choice, there's this crossroads. One path is all about what our ego wants, those demands and desires. And the other path, it's more subtle, maybe even a bit unexpected. That's the path of emotional intelligence.
Yeah, and the more we can see those paths clearly, the better we are at choosing what we really want instead of just reacting automatically.
Absolutely. And the sources we've looked at, especially that one, the intelligence and emotional intelligence, how people make decisions, they show how this works inside our heads. It's like our brains are always running these simulations based on what's happened to us before, and then they create feelings that either push us towards something or pull us away from it.
So, it's like our emotions are giving us a thumbs up or a thumbs down even before we really think about the choices.
Yeah, pretty much. And those emotional signals, they often come from those deep down needs and fears of our ego, and they can really control our choices, even if we don't realize it.
Which makes me wonder, how do we get better at noticing those little hints from our emotions? How do we bring them out in the open so they're not, like, secretly steering us in the wrong direction?
It's all about practicing mindfulness, paying attention to what's happening inside us without judging ourselves. Just notice, like, what you feel in your body, the thoughts that pop up, the emotions that come and go. The more we do this, the better we get at recognizing those emotional signs before they turn into, like, impulsive actions.
So it's like building this radar system inside us that can spot those emotional storms before they hit our decision-making process.
That's it. And when we have that awareness, we get the chance to choose how we respond instead of just being swept along.
But, that's easier said than done, especially when things are really intense and our ego's freaking out and emotions are running high. How do we create that pause, that space to think when it feels like everything's telling us to just react right now?
Well, I think the first step is knowing what our triggers are. Those people, places, or situations that set off our ego's defenses. Once we know what gets to us, we can start figuring out ways to handle those emotional surges. It might be taking some deep breaths, looking at things differently, or just stepping away for a bit to calm down.
It's like we're building a toolbox full of emotional regulation techniques, and each one is designed for the specific problems we face.
Exactly. And when we use those tools the right way, they can help us get through those rough patches with more grace and intention.
As we're talking about handling tough situations, I keep thinking back to those real stories people shared in that Reddit discussion. What does emotional intelligence actually mean? It wasn't just the definitions that got to me, it was those examples of how emotional intelligence, or the lack of it, played out in people's lives.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Those stories really showed how much our choices matter, how they affect things far beyond just ourselves. We saw how empathy could fix broken relationships, how self-control could stop fights from getting worse, and how understanding your own emotional patterns could lead to more self-acceptance and personal growth.
It's like a reminder that emotional intelligence isn't just some theory. It's something we actually live, and it affects our relationships, our work, even how we feel about ourselves.
Absolutely. And it's a journey we can all go on, one step at a time. It's about accepting our emotions, seeing them as valuable information, understanding their power, and using that understanding to make choices that make our lives more real and fulfilling.
And even more important, maybe, is realizing that we're not alone in this. We all have times when our ego takes over or our emotions feel too much.
That's so true. And that shared experience, that's what makes this so interesting to explore. It reminds us that we can learn from each other, help each other grow, and celebrate each other's successes along the way.
So, as we finish this deep dive into the world of ego and emotional intelligence, I want to leave you with something to think about. What if, instead of fighting our emotions, we welcome them as wise guides? Guides who can show us our deepest needs, our values, what we really want. How would changing our view like that change how we move through the world and the choices we make every single day?
I love that. It's like embracing everything about being human, the good and the bad. And as we get better at understanding and working with our emotions with more awareness, kindness, and skill, we open up this whole world of possibilities. A world where our choices come not from our ego, but from the wisdom of our hearts.
Beautifully said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked something in you, made you want to keep exploring this fascinating world of ego and emotional intelligence. And we hope you discover the amazing power that's hidden within your own emotions.